Yeah, well, to the question of the process of writing this book, I just want to read you the first lines of the book. The quote starts with, "I couldn't, I wouldn't, I shouldn't, but I will, I must, I can, and I did, for the me that resonates in you." So the book starts, "Our story of South African jazz is a story that is because it is a story that has become its writer. I was awakened by the passion, understanding, tolerance, and forgiveness of many jazz musicians, jazz ambassadors, jazz warriors, and jazz professors." So the story found me. It made me what I is, and I've gone very deep into the story, and I'm just following the breadcrumbs, so to speak. I set out, I was attracted to the music. I heard Winston Mankunku playing at Yellow Door in Guguletu. I was at university and I realized that, wow, this music is literally freedom. Made me feel free and ready to search for myself. And then of course the Moses Malulekwa era was very intense in terms of finding oneself. This music took us there, and from one step to the next, and then with the senior musicians, they decided they needed a book to, as you say, tell the history that has not yet been told. So, and that's it. I'm kind of a servant within the scene. I see myself as a jazz ambassador, but mostly as a jazz disciple. Okay, well, to the question of the origins of South African jazz, I think American jazz is a great influence and a great school of jazz, but it is not the be-all and end-all. I mean, for instance, they would take American jazz standards and play those, the wonderful recordings from the 60s. Everybody could play Misty, for instance, that song, and the various other standards that musicians would be able to learn their music around and fashion their improvisation. But the thing is South African jazz is unique, and there are a few quotes about that. South African jazz has a unique sound, and that's why it deserves to have a book and a history and a movie and a month-long interviews, because it does have something unique. And it's not going to be easy to find a quote, because most of the book is about what makes it unique. But anyway, there's Robbie Jansen speaks a lot about that, but I think the one that I use a lot is he says, "Jazz is becoming world music. There is no longer African jazz or American jazz. The way I understand it, it is just music. Hey man, it is jazz music. We're just talking about music. Wherever it comes from, it doesn't really matter. It is just music. So when the Americans say jazz music, it is just music." So that's what Robbie says overall. But I did ask him actually to comment on South African jazz is South African jazz, because our jazz is slightly different. I can't explain it in technical terms. When I can hear it, I can know it. Jazz from Ghana or Angola is very different. South African jazz has something of its own. To say Cape jazz is different to Joburg jazz or Durban jazz, I would be overstepping my mark. If there's a difference, it's in the air. So South African jazz is unique. American jazz was a school that allowed the musicians to learn the technique of improvisation, playing freely over chords and chord changes perhaps. But the sound of South African jazz is definitely unique, and that you go into tradition and a huge story that goes into ancient times. The most important question, because as it so happened, the people who chose to go into exile and leave their country were able to create careers eventually that were financially rewarding. Not all, there's some terribly tragic stories in the literature, and Nat Nakasa, of course, committing suicide, and Mongezi Feza dying not very well off in London, maybe a little bit lonely. There's still. So that exile was not for sissies, and that's what Bani Ratchabani said. And he chose Exile. So for Exile, it was another kind of experience. It was possibly a lack of financial opportunities, and that's still happening today. The great story of South African jazz that is not told is very much the Exiles, the Bani Ratchabanis, the Sidumo and Gidi story, and that's a huge focus for me, is to allow these voices to be heard, because they were suppressed, and they were keeping the home fires burning, and very much the brunt of apartheid was suppressing them. I mean, there's stories of cups and saucers in Kanuka. He had to go back and work in the factory. He couldn't sustain playing, and there are probably many musicians that were unable to sustain their careers here. Whereas abroad, there were opportunities, I suppose, to join, the apartheid in exile movement, solidarity, and these kind of things, and even to create careers as Abdullah Ibrahim and Hugh Masekela did. But to actually stand aside and judge those people for what they do would be very incorrect, because it was a very, very tough calling. And Satama B. Benjamin says that very clearly. She said, when she and Abdullah Ibrahim went into exile, Abdullah called his quartet Ikaya, in reference to what was happening back home. And even she wrote a lot of songs about home, Cape Town love and all these things. They missed their homes terribly. So the question on jazz festivals, I've done a lot of research, and I've been a part of the whole evolution and transformation and the establishment of these jazz festivals. I mean, for instance, the Cape Town Jazz Festival, I was there in '99 when they took a group of visiting musicians to the North Sea Jazz and put up a stage in North Sea for South African music. It was Jimmy Dludlu and Moses Mololekwa leading that stage. And obviously Rashid Lombard to then bring back and start a festival. And yes, in the first years it was what you would call purely jazz. I mean, of course, they would bring in some funk. Tower of Power came along, and even Herbie Hancock, who's a great jazz man, he's not afraid of funk. Cantaloupe Island is a killer funk song that's crossed over into hip hop. And Miles Davis, of course, he said, well, what's the point of playing this music to a small audience when I can get out there and play for 30,000 people if I play rock? So Miles Davis moved to rock because of the access to audiences. So everybody has their way to choose how to package their music, and I think crucially jazz should represent freedom, freedom to express yourself. So I absolutely do not think we should say this is jazz and that is not jazz. I think that really we would kill jazz, and that's when Frank Zappa says jazz is not dead, it just smells funny. And he's saying exactly that, because his music incorporated jazz, incredible melodies. He did some wonderful covers. He did Bolero, he did Stolen Moments, so there the jazz can live in that rock environment. All great, well not all, but many great wind instrument and brass instrument players, they learn from a jazz background, but you can take that into any form of music. So I believe that festivals are expanding their reach. Well, to the question of how to sustain a jazz musician, there's no expert answer. However, for me, the point of advice would be to drop the label jazz musician. For me, the jazz musician is not a label that you can empower yourself with. You can maybe empower your egotistical vision of yourself and think, hey, it's cool to be a jazz musician, but to be a jazz musician is not cool. To be a human being maybe is all right. And I think that's the way to empower yourself, to see yourself as a human first and then a musician second. Then the type of music you play, that, can be personal. For people who say, oh, they're only going to play purely jazz, I would believe they're doing that for financial reasons and therefore should not complain about it. Because we surely do not have a calling to play a certain style of music. I mean, Moses Mololekwa, for instance, his Darkness Past album, these were just human ideas. It's a human being expressing him or herself through an instrument. It's the people around them that call it something. They call it jazz, and then they say, well, jazz is not sustainable. So they are limiting the spirit in that way. So my advice very clearly is drop the label jazz musician. Jazz is just music. If you're privileged enough to be able to be a musician and play it, that's great. That's privilege enough. How are you going to make money out of it? That's a beautiful story, that we all work together. We come together. The venues, the festivals, they must work together. And for me, it doesn't have to be genre related to say, oh, we've only got 4 jazz venues here and 2 there and 1 there. Make them African people venues, mixture of artwork. Artists are human beings too. Not just the musicians. Bring everybody in. Allow them to share their wares. Writers have their books here. Poets come and share some insights. And then people themselves, radio presenters, come and share their incredible love and passion, enthusiasm for the music, and we're all part of that family again. And that's how we sustain ourselves.